Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Ford. I'm the Program Director for the Medical Toxicology Fellowship at UC Davis Health. I wanted to share with you all the presentation I developed on the IARC Monographs. The objectives are we're going to talk about what is IARC, I'm going to discuss some updates, and we're going to review the monographs for board testable material. I have no financial interest in any of this. The International Agency Research on Cancer started as an idea from a bereaved husband who wrote to a newspaper editor in Nice, France, after his wife had died from cancer. That editor happened to be a major public figure with connections in high places. He, with 11 other high-ranking officials, managed to convince French President Charles de Gaulle to support an International Institute of Cancer under the guise of the United Nations. After many meetings, IARC was established on May 20th, 1965, as a project to lighten humanity's ever-growing burden of cancer. In deciding on how to fund the project, de Gaulle and colleagues asked 6 countries with the largest military budget to give 0.5% of their budgets to the project. All but Russia agreed. The original 5 were France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Today, there are 27 members of IARC, with the original 5 and 22 others. %70 of the budget is divided evenly amongst these countries. Another 30% is assessed in accordance to a unit system, sort of based on how much the country can afford to pay. There are also voluntary contributions and donations made by individuals and organizations. This is the 2020 to 2021 assessed contributions per country. And you can see that the United States has been assessed to contribute approximately $3.35 million. On their website, they also publish who has paid their contributions. And you can also see at the bottom that the United States has yet to pay for this year and is unlikely to pay given the current administration. This is the preamble, which is a document the working group uses to describe the purpose of IARC, the general principles and procedures, and the process of the scientific review and evaluation, including the selection of agents. This preamble is available as an individual document, and it's also provided in each of the monographs in the introduction to the monograph. The latest update was done in 2019. Over the years, the purpose of IARC has been modified by their own description. Originally, it was they described IARC and the monographs as a compendium on carcinogenic chemicals to be prepared by experts. In 1988, they changed the purpose to say the evaluation of carcinogenic risks. And their latest description is of the purpose is to identify carcinogenic hazards. In selecting agents, the group meets every 5 years. They select agents where there is evidence of human exposure and there is some evidence or suspicion of it causing cancer. They solicit nominations of agents from scientists and government agencies worldwide. And since 2003, IARC also invites nominations from the public. IARC may select other agents if there is a need to rapidly evaluate an emerging carcinogenic hazard or an urgent need to reevaluate a previous classification. In deciding whether an agent is carcinogenic or not, the working groups keep in mind key characteristics of carcinogens. Number 1, the agent is electrophilic or can be metabolically activated to an electrophile. Number 2, the agent is genotoxic. Number 3, the agent alters DNA repair or causes genomic instability. Number 4, the agent induces epigenetic alterations. Number 5, the agent induces oxidative stress. Number 6, the agent induces chronic inflammation. Number 7, the agent is immunosuppressive. Number 8, the agent modulates receptor-mediated effects. Number 9, the agent causes immortalization. And number 10, the agent alters cell proliferation, cell death, or nutrient supply. In the January 2019 update, the preamble update, they describe a reclassification of groupings, and this has a big impact on how agents have been classified and also has an impact on how we should study for the boards. So in their redefining of groups, they have created new groups. Group 1 is the same as group 1 before. It's the agent is carcinogenic. Group 2A is the agent is probably carcinogenic. Group 2B, the agent is possibly carcinogenic. And group 3, the agent is not classifiable as to its carcinogenicity in humans. The working groups are encouraged to add a statement for group 3 agents that the agent is probably not carcinogenic to humans when applicable, but they note that it's nearly impossible to determine the absence of carcinogenicity across all populations for a given agent. So you'll see that there is no more group 4, which was previously defined as the agent is not carcinogenic. So now we're going to talk about specific agents. And I've made the slides hopefully easier to study from with less words and just more picture associations to create memories for faster recall. So at the top of the page, we'll have the agent or industry. We'll have the reference monograph and the year that it was published. And the upper left will be common uses for the agent or industry. In the upper right will be structure. And the lower left will be some miscellaneous, something we should know about the agent for boards or just something interesting about it. And then the lower right will be the type of cancer where there's sufficient evidence that the agent causes. We'll make that distinction of sufficient because in the monographs, they also describe cancers for which there's limited evidence that the agent may cause it. And I don't really think it's worth our time to study that type of cancer for the board. So we'll just focus on the ones where the agent has sufficient evidence to cause that type of cancer. We're also going to focus mainly on just the group 1 agents because these are the agents where there is sufficient evidence that it causes carcinogenicity. The other ones where there are probable carcinogens or possible carcinogens, I think would really make it difficult to develop a test question around those ones. So I think we'll just focus our efforts and our brain power on the group 1 agents. So these are the agents that are carcinogenic to humans. There's sufficient evidence of carcinogenicity in humans, or there's both strong evidence in exposed humans that the agent exhibits key characteristics of carcinogens and sufficient evidence of carcinogenicity in experimental animals. The first agent we'll talk about is aflatoxin. There are 5 subtypes of aflatoxin. There's been a lot of research done around aflatoxin B1, and so that's the representative structure that I've had in the upper right-hand corner. Aflatoxins are produced by the fungus Aspergillus species, and there are several of them that are really high producing of these. So Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus parasiticus produce the most aflatoxins of this genus. The toxins all share very similar physical properties, including their fluorescent in UV light, and they're soluble in water. The toxins can be yellow, some are blue-green, and some are blue. The major host for this fungus is peanuts, maize, and cottonseed. And so this is an ear of corn and some peanuts that are contaminated with Aspergillus fungus. In 2013, there was a Hy-Vee dog food recall because of contaminated corn in the dog food, and several sickened animals from eating the contaminated food. This was mostly affected dog food sold and produced in Midwest states like Iowa and Kansas. Aflatoxin is a group 1 agent with sufficient evidence to cause hepatocellular cancer, probably from its extensive hepatic metabolism and formation of DNA adducts and mutations, especially on the T53P tumor suppressor gene. Asbestos is a term given to naturally occurring silicate fibers of the serpentine and amphibole series. In the serpentine group, the representative fiber is chrysolite, and it's the most widely used in North America. The amphibole group represents all the other ones. So actinolite, amosite, anthophyllite, crocodilite, and tremolite. Crocodilite, you'll see for the amphiboles, these are straight fibers, whereas the chrysolite or serpentine are curly fibers. Asbestos is derived from the Greek word meaning incombustible, which means that it actually has many valuable properties that make it great for heat and electrical insulation, as well as friction generating surfaces such as automobile clutch discs and brake pads. I've personally encountered many patients with asbestos-related lung disease. Most of them were veterans who worked on Navy ships, particularly if they were in the industry of construction of the ships, or just also just in construction in general back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Asbestos has been outlawed for several decades, but it can still be found in older homes. And so when remodeling projects go on, one would have to be careful that there's no asbestos in the insulation in their homes. Asbestos is a class 1 agent with sufficient evidence to cause mesothelioma, ovarian cancer, lung cancer, and laryngeal cancer. Alcohol, unfortunately, is a class 1 agent causing cancer. This is a representative example of some of my whiskeys that I have. Everything in moderation. This is not the structure for ethanol. This is the structure for acetaldehyde. So alcohol, as you guys all know, is metabolized from alcohol to acetaldehyde by alcohol dehydrogenase, and then to acetate by aldehyde dehydrogenase. There are two isoforms for aldehyde dehydrogenase. There's a cytosolic and a mitochondrial. The mitochondrial aldehyde dehydrogenase is referred to as ALDH2 and is the most efficient at removing acetaldehyde. The normal allele is denoted ALDH2 star 1, and most Caucasians will have 2 good copies of this isoform. A single point mutation creates a less efficient enzyme denoted ALDH2 star 2. This mutation is nearly absent in Europeans, but is highly prevalent in Asia. And it's responsible for Asian alcohol flushing syndrome, which is a deterrent to drinking more alcohol, but the acetaldehyde is present longer, and therefore there's an increased prevalence of cancers of the esophagus and stomach cancer in populations where this allele is more prevalent, such as in Asia. So again, while there's not a high incidence of alcoholism, there is a high incidence of cancer, particularly in the Asian and Jewish descent, where these mutations occur more commonly. The cancers that have been shown to have sufficient evidence of alcohol causing our oral cavity, larynx, esophagus, liver, colorectal, and cancer of the female breast. Aristolochoic acid is very difficult to say. I had to practice several times. It comes from a very interesting looking plant species, a family of plants called the Aristolochiaceae. The Aristolochia clematis is one where a lot of these acids can be found. It's been used in traditional Chinese medicine for several decades. 2 agents exist. I put one of the representative structures in the upper right-hand corner. It's had many uses or purported uses, particularly in Chinese herbal medicine, one of them being as a weight loss agent, but also as an anti-inflammatory agent, a diuretic, for the treatment of edema, as an anti-neoplastic, and as an antiseptic. In the early 1990s, there were several reports of a possible link between its use in kidney disorders, including nephropathy and cancer. And IARC has established sufficient evidence that it causes a unique cancer, the transitional cell urothelium, that lines the renal pelvis and ureters. Benzo-A-pyrene is a representative agent for a group referred to as the polyaromatic hydrocarbons. Polyaromatic hydrocarbons are ubiquitous in the environment. They can be found in soil, water, air, some food, and some medications. It's also the byproduct of combustion. So major sources of like coal, wood, fossil fuels, if you burn those, you can be exposed to these polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And cigarette smoke is actually a source of polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And interestingly enough, the side smoke of a cigarette will have more benzo-A-pyrene than the mainstream smoke, which is what is inhaled by the smoker. The benzo-A-pyrenine is metabolized to this epoxide, which is responsible for causing cancer. It's these metabolites cause DNA adducts and mutations, particularly in tumor suppressant genes. Occupations where patients or people can be exposed are the chimney sweeps. So back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, chimney sweeps, or just industries that use tar, so like street pavers, construction workers can be exposed to it as well. This is a painting drawn by Dr. Horace Hope Dobell in the late 1800s. So it just shows that even back then, chimney sweeps had an increased prevalence of scrotal cancer, and they actually contributed more so to poor hygiene. It wasn't discovered later that it was actually the benzo-A-pyrenine and polyaromatic hydrocarbons, but it's a squamous cell cancer of the scrotum. And they're also, the benzo-A-pyrenine is also associated with lung cancer. Benzene is a component of oil, gas, light oil, and petroleum. Historically, it was used as a degreaser and a solvent. Today, 90% of benzene is used to make other chemicals like ethyl benzene, which is in turn converted to styrene and polystyrene. Cumene, which is converted to phenol, aniline, maleic anhydride, cyclohexane, and nitrobenzene. Workers in industries such at all stages of oil production and refinement, such as any industry that uses petroleum to make things like plastic or rubber, truck drivers, even cab drivers are exposed to benzene. Benzene is metabolized extensively by CYP2E1 into several metabolites. And in particular, the 1,4-benzoquinone and the 1,2-benzoquinone have been shown to be directly toxic to the bone marrow. And so benzene has sufficient evidence to cause acute myeloid leukemia. Beryllium historically was used in fluorescent light bulbs. Now it's used extensively in aerospace because it's almost the ideal metal, if only it didn't cause cancer, but it's lighter than aluminum, stronger than steel, and resists corrosion and thermal expansion. This is what it looks like. Second lightest metal on the periodic table. Important to know for the boards that the beryllium can cause both acute and chronic lung disease, with chronic being the more common of the two. The chronic disease has both a restrictive and obstructive lung disease pattern. Patients can develop these non-caseating granulomas in the lung, particularly in the hilum, which is very nonspecific, can be seen in other conditions like tuberculosis, sarcoidosis, and pneumoconiosis. In order to determine if it's from beryllium, you can do a beryllium lymphocyte proliferation test, which There are only a handful of labs, and one of them is Oak Ridge Institute in Tennessee. But essentially, they take the worker patient's blood and they centrifuge off the lymphocytes. They wash them and they count them, and they combine them with media and serum containing beryllium. They also have a control, some control wells with no beryllium. Then they add a radioactive marker, and then they count the number of lymphocytes in the beryllium median compared to the control media and see if there's been a stimulation and proliferation of the lymphocytes from the beryllium. And if so, you'll get a positive result, and that's how the diagnosis of berylliosis is made. Beryllium has sufficient evidence to cause lung cancer. Betelquid, arecanut, there's two separate entries for this one in the monographs. There's with and without tobacco. This is also referred to as PAN, which is P-A-N or P-A-A-N. It's common in many parts of Asia and in migrant communities arising from them. It's used by men and women, with some studies showing that women may use more than men. It's not always chewed. Sometimes it's kept in the mouth, just sort of sucked on for a prolonged period of time, so there's prolonged contact with the oral mucosa. The betel leaf comes from the Piper betel vine, and the erica nut comes from Erica ketachew, and these are the once they've been dried and cut, and this is how it might look in a market to buy. Local preferences will vary on what else is used with the betel leaf and erica nut. So depending on where you live, you may add saffron, cloves, turmeric, sweeteners, menthol. Ketachew is a spice that's often used. It's an astringent. It's an extract of the acacia tree from the bark. Often used as slack lime, which is actually just calcium hydroxide. It's a very caustic. And the most important aspect of this practice is the erica nut, because it contains several of these alkaloids, particularly the ericoline and the ericadine, which have been shown kind of independently to cause DNA adducts and mutations, and is responsible for causing cancer. So chewing betelquid often leads to leukoplakia and fibrosis in the mouth, and then eventually leads to cancer. And so these are oral pharyngeal cancer is associated with betelquid and areca nut chewing. Bis-chloromethyl ethyl and chloromethyl methyl ether. These are two chemicals with very similar properties and similar uses. They're primarily used as intermediates in the production of plastics, resins, and polymers. So this is styrene going to polystyrene, and the polymerization process is enhanced with the use of bis-chloromethyl ether. But other things can be polymerized, like plant starches and polysaccharides. The BCME and CMME, they're both DNA alkylating agents, so cause point mutations and fragmentations and alter repair enzymes. And BCME and CMME have been shown with sufficient evidence to cause unique lung cancer called oat cell cancer, which is just another name for small cell cancer. 1,3-butane-diene, so up in the upper left-hand corner, some of you Formula One fans like myself might notice those are the soft and intermediate compound tires for Formula One cars, and that's because 1,3-butane-diene is used extensively in the rubber and tire industries. So that's the structure of it. And like most agents, the metabolic products of 1,3-butane-diene are responsible for cancer. So it's the epoxybutene and the diepoxybutane, particularly the diepoxybutane, which are responsible for being most mutagenic. And there's sufficient evidence that that epoxybutane and just working with 1,3-butane diene causes leukemia. 1,2-dichloropropane. Historically, it was used to clean offset printing presses. One of the largest cohort studies was in Japan, where 1,1,1-trichloroethylene was being phased out because it depleted the ozone layer. So they were using 1,2-dichloropropane in very poorly ventilated areas with no PPE and just being constantly exposed to this chemical. They started to develop a very high prevalence of cancer. This is the structure, pretty simple. 1,2-dichloropropane nowadays, at least here in the United States, is used as an intermediate to making other chemicals. One of those is tetrachloroethylene, also known as PERC, which is used extensively in the dry cleaning process, or industry rather. PERC, by the way, is a 2A agent, so not, it's probably carcinogenic. And 1,2-dichloropropane has sufficient evidence that it causes a very unique cancer of the bile duct, so referred to as cholangiocarcinoma. Diethylstilbestrol is a synthetic estrogen. It was prescribed from 1938 to 1971 to prevent spontaneous abortion and other pregnancy problems. It continued to be prescribed despite a study in 1953 that showed that it didn't prevent spontaneous abortions. And the FDA actually advised not to prescribe it anymore, but it's still prescribed for almost another 2 decades. This is the structure. Hopefully we'll never be asked to know that one. So for the cancers that there's sufficient evidence to cause, women who are exposed to diethylstilbestrol, there's sufficient evidence that it causes breast cancer in them. And in the female fetuses that were exposed to diethylstilbestrol, there's sufficient evidence that it causes clear cell adenocarcinoma of the cervix and vagina. There's not sufficient evidence to suggest any type of cancer for the male fetuses that was exposed. Ethylene oxide is used as a fumigant and sterilant for medical equipment, packaging, and pharmaceuticals. It's also used to make other glycols, such as ethylene glycol. Structure, again, is a pretty simple epoxide. The epoxide itself directly alkylates DNA, which, again, causes mutations and inhibits or damages repair mechanisms. It's interesting to note that 80% of ethylene oxide is metabolized by epoxide hydroxylase to ethylene glycol, but the amount of ethylene glycol produced is never enough to cause ethylene glycol toxicity. For instance, the highest concentration in one patient was found to be about 9 milligrams per deciliter, so not enough to cause a metabolic acidosis or renal problems. There is limited evidence that ethylene oxide causes any one cancer in humans, but there's sufficient evidence in animals and a sufficient mechanism to cause cancer. In particular, it's these lymphohematopoietic cancers such as multiple myeloma, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is difficult to avoid for most of us. It's in a lot of building materials, such as resins, particle board, gypsum board, which is drywall. Some of you might recall after the Katrina disaster and the FEMA trailers were under scrutination for having too much formaldehyde, and it was probably due to the drywall that was purchased from a Chinese company that just when in all these products, when formaldehyde is used, the formaldehyde will off gas and become part of the indoor air that people breathe. OSHA has a permissible exposure limit for that indoor amount of formaldehyde, and it's 0.9 milligrams per meter cubed. Yeah. That's the structure. We all know that one. And there's sufficient evidence that formaldehyde causes nasopharyngeal cancer. Iron foundry workers. So in the monographs, there are agents that they describe, and then there are industries that are described and are associated with some cancers. So one of them that I want to talk about is the iron foundry workers. So metal foundry is one of the oldest industries in civilization. So melting metal and using it to make a tool or some other device has been done for, since early times, since fire. It's actually a pretty complicated process, but it can be broken down into two main operations. There's the sand molding, and then there's the casting of the metal. So the casting of the metal, you essentially are just melting metal, whether that comes from raw ore or it comes from recycled metals. Some of these recycled metals can have agents that are linked to cancer, such as like cadmium and nickel, asbestos too, if it's being mined, or so it can be, those can all be part of it. And then the benzoate just from the melting and burning of like the coke and oil and just melting of these metals. So workers in these industries are exposed to many chemicals that can cause cancer, and these are just a representative amount one. So polyaromatic hydrocarbons, cadmium, nickel, asbestos, and by the way, these are all class 1 agents for causing lung cancer. And I just thought, just for interesting, since sand molding is a part of the industry, the workers are also exposed to a lot of silica dust, and so silica has been shown to cause silicosis in several workers in these industries. Painters are exposed to many agents because paint is made of dyes, plasticizers, and binders. Several agents have been used for dyes. Azopigments were widely used in the 1960s and contained benzidine. So this is the structure for benzidine. Some agents and dyes also contain 2-naphthylamine and orthotoluidine, and so those are also linked to cancer. Some of the agents some of the dyes that have been studied and are most widely associated with causing cancer are these agents, or these dyes here. And so kind of the easy thing to remember for all of these dyes is that they're all associated with bladder cancer. So benzidine, 2-naphthylamine, orthotoluidine, aniline, they're all class 1 agents with sufficient evidence to cause bladder cancer. Phenacetin. Phenacetin was introduced in 1887 as an analgesic and antipyretic. It's often used in combination with aspirin, codeine, or caffeine, much like acetaminophen is today. This is the structure, and those of you that are good with structures recognize that this is pretty close to acetaminophen, and that's because acetaminophen is actually a major metabolite of phenacetin. This in the lower left-hand corner is the other thing to kind of know about phenacetin, is that it's associated with renal papillary necrosis, which was one of the causes of causing analgesic nephropathy. So there's sufficient evidence that phenacetin causes cancer of the renal pelvis and ureter, and we all know that acetaminophen doesn't cause cancer. So it's actually the other metabolites of phenacetin that have been shown to cause cancer. And these are kind of really hard to pronounce, but N-hydroxyphenetidine and P-nitrosphentol. So these are minor metabolites. Again, acetaminophen is a major metabolite of phenacetin, but the minor metabolites are the ones that are associated with cancer of the renal pelvis and ureter. Plutonium 239 is most widely used radionucleotide in nuclear power plants and for making nuclear bombs because it's one of a few isotopes that can undergo fission, which is the process of bombarding an element with neutrons until it breaks up and releases massive amounts of energy. So it's often found in the reactor cores. It undergoes alpha decay to uranium-235. So the alpha particles are a helium ion. It has an absurd half-life of 24,000 years. So it sticks around for a long, long time. This is Chernobyl, modern-day Chernobyl. Chernobyl was the site of a major nuclear disaster on April 26, 1986, in which there was a failed safety test that caused an explosion of the reactor core. Despite plutonium being one of those main reactor core elements, it was actually other radionucleotides that were released into the environment, such as iodine-131, cesium-134, and cesium-137. There's widespread contamination. And in the areas surrounding Chernobyl, there's a very high prevalence of thyroid cancers. Plutonium itself, there is sufficient evidence that plutonium causes lung cancer, liver cancer, and bone cancer. Polychlorinated biphenyls. These are very stable chemicals, and they're highly resistant to heat, electricity, and pressure. So as such, they're frequently used in electrical capacitors and transformers as hydraulic fluid and as a heat transfer fluid. There are dozens of these polychlorinated biphenyls, each with varying amounts of chlorinated parts of these carbon groups. This is Viktor Yushchenko. He's the third president of Ukraine, and he was the victim of a failed assassination attempt in 2004 with 2,3,7 tetrachlorodibenzoparadioxin, or as we refer to as just dioxin. So polychlorinated biphenyls are IARC group 1 with sufficient evidence to cause melanoma, whereas dioxin in particular can cause cancer of all sites. And so dioxin's a class 1, all sites, PCBs can cause melanoma. This is radium. Radium was discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, and it was unique and sought after because of its radioluminescent properties. Radium decays to radon via an alpha particle. The famous kind of historical significance of radium is rather unfortunate. So these women are often referred to as like the radium girls or radium women, because women often worked in the factories producing watches and clock faces, and the watches, clock face, the numbers would be painted with a radium paint so that it would luminesce, you know, so it could be seen at nighttime. In order to make the tip of their paintbrush finer and pointier, they would lick the tip of the brush so that they could paint a more finer number onto the watch dial. Unfortunately, by doing this, they were internalizing these alpha producing radiation isotopes. And over a short period of time, it became known that a lot of these women would suffer from bone cancers, particularly osteosarcoma of the jaw. But because it was internalized, they would have bone cancers other places as well. So next is radon. So radium breaks down to radon, which is another problem, another cancer-causing radioisotope. Radon is a noble gas, and it's naturally occurring. It's released from rocks and soil and contaminates our water and air. Radon testing around the US has shown that there are very high concentrations in Colorado, Minnesota, Iowa, and the Northeast. Some risk factors that have been found associated with higher concentrations of radon in homes are having a basement, having cracks in the foundation or gaps in the walls, can allow the radon to creep in to the home. There are home radon tests that are available, and some states require it for the purchase and sale of a home. I've grown up in California my whole life, went away to Pennsylvania briefly for a few years for med school. I've never had to do a radon test, but my wife is from Pennsylvania, recalls in high school doing a radon home test as a project for one of her classes. So very common in other parts of the country, not very common in California. For the boards, important to know that radon will eventually break down into stable lead, and that the EPA recommended indoor action level, where you need to do some sort of remediation to your house, is greater than or equal to 4 picocuries per liter. The EPA makes a distinction that they will recommend you do something at around 2 picocuries per liter, because even that has been shown to substantially increase risk of cancer. But the hard, fast limit is 4 for the boards. And radon is the #1 cause of lung cancer in the United States. Next is thorium. So thorium-232, the representative use for this one was as a IV contrast agent called Thoratrast. Thorium is very abundant naturally and has many uses. It was used as an IV contrast agent in the 1930s and 40s. Some of the indications were cerebral angiography and splenography for it. It was estimated that probably 10 million patients were exposed to this contrast agent. Interesting to know that after one injection, less than 1% of the thorium and its decay products are excreted in urine and feces up to 1 year, given it a biological half-life of over 400 years. One single injection of IV Thoratrast increased the risk of cancer in these patients by 100-fold. The thorium will remain essentially in their bodies for the rest of their lives. This is in the lower left corner is a patient that had an abdominal X-ray 24 years after they had received exposure to an IV Thoratrast. Thorium rather, has sufficient evidence to cause liver cancer. So 2/3 are carcinoma, predominantly cholangiocarcinoma, but then 1/3 of them is an angiosarcoma, which in normal population is very rare, but in this population that was exposed to thorium is exceedingly high, and probably the one they would ask for on the board. So angiosarcoma of the liver for thorium. This is trichloroethylene, or TCE. TCE is historically used as a degreaser and a dry cleaning solvent. So as a degreaser, it was used a lot on like military bases. So you'll see a lot of contaminated water and soil around these places with TCE. Here's the chemical structure. And this is actually a representative map of the United States where some of these Superfund sites are. So not all Superfund sites are contaminated with TCE, but many of them are, especially around here in Sacramento. We have several military bases and one Aerojet Rocketdyne, which used to produce rocket engines. Now they moved to another state, but the soil is being remediated for containing TCE. And all this information, by the way, is available public. You can find it on the Superfund site from the EPA. There's sufficient evidence that TCE causes renal cell cancer. Vinyl chloride. 95% of vinyl chloride is made into PVC resin and then finally made into pipes. So all the pipes for our landscaping and in our homes, many of the pipes in our homes are made out of PVC and vinyl chloride. Some of the plastics in our, for instance, in our office or our car can also contain PVC. Here's the structure of vinyl chloride. And here's the other thing we should know about vinyl chloride for the boards. Causes this acro-osteolysis, and it's got a very particular type of acro-osteolysis, so it's going to be mid-shaft resorption. So if you look, you kind of got this little bony island on the distal phalanx, so this mid-shaft has been reabsorbed. So this is not specific to vinyl chloride. This can actually occur in other disease states like scleroderma. And there are other types of acro-osteolysis, such as like distal tuft resorption, which can happen with just repeated trauma, even in people who play guitar for too long. Vinyl chloride has sufficient evidence to cause angiosarcoma of the liver and hepatocellular carcinoma. So moving on to the group 2 agents. So these are agents that are probably carcinogenic to humans. And in this group, they've fulfilled at least 2 of the following evaluations, including at least one that involves either exposed human or human cells or tissues. So there's limited evidence of carcinogenicity in humans. There's sufficient evidence of carcinogenicity in experimental animals. And there's strong evidence that the agent exhibits key characteristics of carcinogens. One of the agents I thought was interesting is glyphosate. So glyphosate is the one of the primary chemicals of Roundup, which is the #1 herbicide in the United States. Hopefully we'll never be asked the structure of glyphosate. You guys have probably become aware of glyphosate in the news because of recent court rulings and big money payouts for patients who developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma after being exposed to glyphosate. And this is kind of in contradiction to a lot of other health and environmental agencies. So even our own EPA has put out a statement that there's no evidence that glyphosate, I misspelled that, I'm really sorry, but glyphosate causes cancer. And other countries have done the same. So New Zealand, Japan, Germany, European Food and Safety Authority, Canada, they all have done their own research and came up with a similar conclusion that glyphosate, there's no evidence that it causes cancer. So big controversy with these payouts and the ruling of IARC's and categorization of IARC. Group 2B is the agent is possibly carcinogenic to humans. And this applies when only one of the following evaluations has been made by the work group. So there's limited evidence of carcinogenicity in humans. There's sufficient evidence of carcinogenicity in experimental animals. There's strong evidence that the agent exhibits key characteristics of carcinogens, regardless of whether from exposed humans or human cells or from experimental systems. Interesting agent I found for this group 2B was ginkgo biloba extract. So ginkgo biloba has been used to improve memory and as a natural blood thinning medication. This is ginkgolide B, which was found to antagonize platelet activating factor receptor. It's probably responsible for the increased risk of bleeding. This is what the leaf looks like, which easily identifiable and testable for the boards. And for this one, there's inadequate evidence of carcinogenicity in humans, but there's sufficient evidence in experimental animals. So you might tell somebody who's using this that there's no evidence it works for memory and will only increase risk of bleeding and possibly increase risk of cancer. So group 3 is the agent is not classifiable as to its carcinogenicity in humans. And these are agents that do not fall into any of the previous groups. And this applies when there is less than sufficient evidence in animals and inadequate evidence in humans. So the representative agent that I want to talk about is caprolactam. Caprolactam is used to make nylon 6. Nylon 6 is used to make a lot of things that we use, particularly people who like to do things outdoors. So fishing line, nets, tents, shoes, ropes, thread spools, things like that. All of that is from nylon 6 and caprolactam. There's a structure thing we should know about for the boards, and hopefully they won't ask this anymore, but it was previously the only IARC group 4 agent, meaning that it was the only agent for which it did not cause cancer. So now they've regrouped caprolactam into group 3 because they now, again, have kind of made the statement that there's no way to say that any agent doesn't cause cancer because there's just no way to test every agent in every setting, in every population. So there's no evidence that caprolactam causes anything, but they won't go so far as to say that it doesn't cause anything. Another group 3 agent is talc, and they actually have the distinction of talc not containing asbestos. And then there's another entry for talc not containing asbestos applied to the perineum. Talc is a naturally occurring magnesium silicate. It's very soft. It can be pulverized in a very soft powder. It's got a very interesting plate-like planar structure of magnesium and silica. And in particularly women who applied the talc to the perineum, there's been an association with causing ovarian cancer. So the problem with talc is that it's very hard to find talc that doesn't contain asbestos. So the FDA did a study in March of 2020, and they were able to show that a lot of over-the-counter cosmetic products contain trace amounts of asbestos fibers, particularly tremolite. So it's probably, again, not the talc, but it's probably the contaminant that is associated with the cancer. And for talc that's applied to the perineum, that's a IARC 2B, but for all other talc use, it's a class 3 agent. So for more information, you can go to the IARC website. Everything is free, very easy to obtain. They're very transparent. And I hope that you all learned something. I hope you find this useful when studying for the boards. Again, I would focus just on the class 1 agents. And thank you very much for your time and attention. Good luck to everyone.